Hi, welcome to our first video lecture in Data-Informed Leadership. Um, we're looking today at why we test, and this lecture presumes that you've already read the chapter from James Popham. So I hope you have, and even so, I believe you'll find this really informative and helpful. We're going to look today at instructionally supportive assessments. I mean, after all, we test in order to make our instruction better, don't we? So if our assessments support good instruction, then that's really what we're after. Okay, so instructionally supportive assessments will help us teach better. We're going to look today at the 9 elements that instructionally supportive assessments must have. You might remember that when Secretary DeVos was coming up for her confirmation hearings, she was asked if she supported a proficiency model or a growth model for assessments. In other words, did she support tests that would show if kids had mastered the curriculum or if they had grown from one year to the next? She was not able to answer that question. She didn't know the answer to that question, which you guys will understand is a very important question. As we go through the elements that we're going to present in this lecture, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the standardized tests that have been out there, Smarter Balanced, the ones written by Pearson, and of course here in New Jersey we're all familiar with PARCC. I want you to ask yourself if the standardized tests that you know about have the 9 elements that we're going to talk about today. So in 2001, these organizations got together, the American Association of School Administrators, the National Associations of Elementary and Secondary Principals, the National Education Association, which you know is the largest teacher union, and in fact, it's the largest union in the country of any kind, and the National Middle School Association. And they formed the Commission on Instructionally Supportive Assessments as standardized tests were really on the rise and being pushed all over the country. In response to No Child Left Behind, they came together and said, okay, well, so what do good instructionally supportive assessments have? What should they do, and what qualities should they have? Jim Popham, the guy who wrote the chapter that you read for today, he actually chaired that commission. So here we're going to lay out the 9 elements that instructionally supportive assessments should have. First, they should prioritize certain content standards. We already test in English language arts and math primarily, but even within English language arts and math, we don't want to be testing everything. We want to prioritize the stuff that's really important. Second, it should be really clear in those standards just what the knowledge and skills are that we're testing. And finally, once we've been clear about what the content is and what the important content is, when we get the results back, we want the results standard by standard. Otherwise, they're really not all that helpful. Second, these standardized tests aren't the only ways of assessing kids. We still want teachers to have the option to assess kids in other ways and in the other curriculum areas and the other subjects. We want curriculum that is beyond the test. We hear all the time about don't just teach the test, right? Math is important, English language arts is important, social studies and science are also really important. Music, art, phys ed are also really important. We don't want a curriculum that's just defined by the tests. Also, we want to make sure that our tests are set up so that all students can show what they know and can do, right? If the tests exclude certain groups of students, either culturally or based on the way that they're written and set up, that's really not going to help, right? We'll have whole groups of kids who were left out. Finally, this commission said, look, it takes 3 years to write a decent test. We should have professional development for teachers on how you tie those results to good teaching. If these assessments are supposed to support good teaching and support good instruction, we can't just hand over the results and say, here, go teach. We need professional development with folks about how you actually do that well. And finally, they said, listen, these test writers, Pearson and Park and the other big corporations, they need to provide evidence that these tests are being used in the proper way, that the tests they're writing do what they say they're doing. Okay, so now we're now going to break down each of those 9 a bit more. When we talk about content standards prioritized, we want to prioritize the content over the performance. In other words, what are the knowledge and skills, not how do we show them. Okay. We don't want a lot of content standards to be assessed. We want the stuff that's really going to last, the stuff that kids really need. We need to prioritize what's really important. Otherwise, we have massive assessments, massive tests that we'll never get through, and there's way too much information, and they will kill kids' motivation, and they'll kill our ability as teachers and school leaders to actually get our hands around what's really important. Second, this commission said educators really need to know clearly what it is they're teaching. These standards have to be written so that people get what they mean. We've seen a lot of controversy around the Common Core in the states that have adopted the Common Core, for example, that educators don't necessarily understand what it is they're to be teaching. Well, if the tests are going to support good instruction and we're going to prioritize certain standards, don't you think it's a good idea if teachers really understand clearly what it is they're supposed to be teaching? And finally, we need specific results to make data-driven decisions, okay? You need to be really clear that standard by standard, here's what kids know and here's what they can do. If it's too global, we can't make good decisions about what to test next or what we've done really well on, we want to keep, what we want to change, what we have to go back and reteach, etc. Okay, if that's not specific, it's not useful data. It's not helpful. Right? You walk into the doctor, and the doctor tells you, "Oh, you're sick." Like, okay, I'm sick. What's sick about me? Like, what's the problem? Is it my heart? Is it my weight? Is it my skin? Like, what's the problem? I need specific results so that you, doctor, and I together can make good decisions about what I need to be doing for my health, right? We also want to make sure that the standards that are not tested across the state are also important, right? It's not just those things that we prioritized. That's not what all of our curriculum and all our assessment needs to be. The teachers should have the option, of course, in their classrooms, and school by school should have the options to keep assessing what kids are doing in other areas. That just makes sense. We don't want the standardized tests and the clones of those standardized tests, like the practice tests and so forth, to be all that we're doing in school. Likewise, we don't want all of our curriculum to be focused solely on the tests, right? We've heard this, I mentioned this earlier. We don't want to strictly teach to the test. We need well-rounded citizens. We need well-rounded people in our society. And if we don't teach math, if we don't teach music, phys ed, art, science, social studies, etc., we won't have that. So we can't allow the tests to constrict and narrow what we're teaching. And finally, especially when it comes to English language learners and students with disabilities, we need to make sure that these tests are accessible to everybody. Can everybody show what they know and can do? Do the tests have cultural biases that get in the way? Right? We want to make sure that they are free of all those biases and they are accessible to all learners. Otherwise, we don't really know what whole groups of kids know and can do, and we can't make good instructional decisions with respect to those students. Now, the commission also said listen, test writers, it's going to take 3 years to write decent tests. If they're made too fast, they won't support instruction well, and they won't give accurate information. Okay, for schools being held accountable, teachers being held accountable, and so forth. Get this right. Take the time. That was really clear to them. Don't just rush it out to market. Second, a lot of professional development is needed so that teachers know how to use the results to teach with. Okay, you may have been a part of those. If you haven't already, you ought to be. Um, how do we actually use these things to tie to teaching? I'll tell you a story from when I was in my first principal's job, and we gave a standardized test. That was a little bit before this era. And I asked the teachers of the schools my first year, and I said, so those ELA and math tests, what do we do with them? And they looked at me kind of blankly, and they said, what do you mean, Josh? So, well, what do we do with those tests? They said, well, we give them. I said, well, yeah. And after that, then what do we do? And there were kind of crickets in the room. And I realized this was just some random exercise they were doing because they had to. So one of the things, for example, we did in terms of our professional development was all of the teachers in the school actually took I think we chose the 3rd grade math test. Like, okay, what does that math test look like? What do you actually have to know and be able to do in order to do well on that test? That was really eye-opening for the whole faculty, right? What would kids actually need to know and be able to do well on this? It wasn't just a matter of teaching out a textbook and teaching those lesson plans and then giving these tests once a year, and then they kind of weren't connected at all. That kind of professional development really is key. And finally, the states that buy these tests, right, so Pearson and Park and so forth, those are contracts that are made on a statewide level. The states should require evidence that the tests actually do what they say they're doing, right? Do they accurately measure student learning? Are they accurate enough to hold teachers and schools accountable for them? Will they enhance teaching? And finally, do they not harm students? Now, one thing that has unfortunately gone on here is that all of these tests are actually based on tests that were developed not quite 100 years, but they're the same format as a test that was developed between the First and Second World War. It was called the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, the ASVAB test for short. Now, all these tests are basically the same kind of tests as that Armed Services test. That test was given to all recruits in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines when they first entered. And it was given to them not to find out how fast they could run, or whether they could shoot well, or whether they could do the multiple skills and knowledge that you need to be an effective soldier. That test was given only to figure out who were the good candidates to become officers, and then who were the rest, right? It was to separate out the soldiers who were going to become officers from the regular grunt soldiers. So what that test did really, really well was it sorted and sifted the soldiers into 2 groups. It did not tell the boot camp what it is these guys can do and what it is they know so that they could be trained better. It just picked out a group of officer candidates. Well, the tests we have today, Park, Pearson, etc., they do what the ASVAB test did, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. They sift and sort kids really well into groups 4, 3, 2, and 1, right? We know those groups. Kids who are at level 4, kids who are level 3, level 2, and level 1. They do not do an especially good job, because they're not designed to, of telling us what it is kids know and can do, and therefore they're not an especially good tool for holding schools and teachers accountable for the results. And they don't do an especially good job of enhancing teaching, right? But they are sold as doing that kind of thing. So we need to be more literate. We need to be smarter about it than the general public is, and even than some of our leaders are. And we have to also insist, right, that these tests don't harm kids. And we've seen in the opt-out movement that there are lots of families who are really concerned about the harm being done to kids with these tests. Now, any instructionally supportive assessment also should do some other things. Okay. First, we want to know that they're measuring students' mastery of the curriculum, right? That seems fairly basic, but they really should do that. Second, the test makers, when they write these things, should offer 3 kinds of evidence that support the fact that they do that. They don't tend to do that, but we as leaders and we as educators should push our leaders to make sure that the test makers do that. And if we do that, then it's fair to say that they're valid, right? If they measure students' mastery of what's being taught and there's good solid evidence of it, then okay, they're valid. We also want to know that the tests are reliable. Okay, so what does a reliable test have? First, it's stable, right? It's going to give roughly the same results this year, next year, the year after that. We've seen in some states, especially up in New York, if you were paying attention, that some years you can get some wildly different results out of the test, which is supposed to be the same. If that happens, it's not a stable test. A stable test is going to give you roughly the same results year to year. Second, if we're testing skills and knowledge, right, the test should be able to do that in alternate forms. We don't want the format of the test to get in the way of what kids know and can do. So in New Jersey, right, we know this is a real issue with the PARCC tests. The PARCC tests are fully online. Are we testing kids' skills with using a computer, or are we testing what they know about English language arts and math? If we're really testing what they know in English language arts and math, it should work in a performance format. It should work in a pen and paper format. It should work in an online format, right? All of those forms really should give you the same results. If they don't, then you're measuring the format of the test, not kids' knowledge and skills. And third, a reliable test is what we call internally consistent. That means that you're going to have a number of questions in the ELA test, let's say about text structure, about beginning, middle, and end, or about, let's just stick with beginning, middle, and end. Okay? You may have several questions about beginning, middle, and end on the test. Kids should be able to get the same result in those questions about beginning, middle, and end. If you're getting wildly different results from 3 different questions about beginning, middle, and end, that's not an internally consistent test. Same thing is, let's say, true with fractions, let's say in a math test. If you've got a handful of questions about fractions, but you're getting way different results on those questions, you don't have internal consistency. You got to be able to prove that internal consistency. And these are the kinds of things, stability, alternate forms, and internal consistency are the kinds of things it takes some time to develop, right? It's going to take you several years if you're a test creator to come up with those things to make sure you've got a reliable test. Okay, so to sum up, why do we test? We test so that we can become better teachers and our kids can learn more, right? So this slide here goes back through the things that we just discussed about useful instructionally supportive testing. Again, that was put together by school administrators of all levels, especially elementary and secondary principals, Middle School Association, and the American Education Association, which was there really to support and give a voice to teachers. So if you're good with this, you really have a good, solid understanding of what a decent test should be, and you are getting to be far more literate about assessment than most folks in our field. And with that, I thank you. I hope this has been useful for you.